Today we're going to look at operations on functions. Basically, how do you take functions, add, subtract, multiply, and divide them? And how do you discover their domain? So it's pretty straightforward, especially with adding and subtracting. If you see this, f plus g of x, that means the same thing as f of x plus g of x. Add your functions. If you see f minus g of x, then that means to subtract the functions. And we'll look at those to make sure you understand what to do when there. For product, if you see f times g of x, then that means to multiply the functions. And if you see f over g, f divided by g of x, then that means to divide the functions. Okay? Example 1 asked us to find the domain of the function g of x is equal to 5x over x squared minus 49. Now, the best way to find the domain of a function when you don't have a graph especially, and you can always look at the graph and see where it's undefined, but to do it algebraically, we take the bottom and set it equal to 0. Because we can't allow... Oh, my pen's not working. Hang on. Oh, there it is. We can't allow... It's still not working. Okay, I think my pen's working now. So, we take the bottom and we set it equal to 0. And the reason we do that is because the bottom can't be 0. Anywhere that the bottom of a function would be 0 would be undefined, because if you try to divide by 0, it's undefined. So if we set the bottom equal to 0, that will tell us where the function is undefined, where we would end up with 0 on the bottom. Okay. So you could factor this if you wanted to. Easier way would just be to add 49 to both sides and then take the square root of both sides. Remember that if you take the square root, then you would get a positive or a negative number. So x could be positive or negative 7, because negative 7 times negative 7 is also positive 49. So our function is undefined at x equals negative 7 and at x equals 7. Now, we need to make sure that we can write this in interval notation. So to do that, we start with our parentheses, negative infinity, and we're going to stop at negative 7 and close that with a parentheses because we're not including negative 7. Unioned with, pick back up at negative 7 and go to 7. Again, closing with parentheses because we're not including 7. And then unioned with, picking up at 7. And now we can go on to infinity. Let's try it out. So the first one, we're going to add f of x, where f of x is x minus 5 and g of x is x squared minus 1. We're going to add. So this means the same thing as f of x plus g of x. So we take f of x, that's x minus 5, and we add to it g of x, that's x squared minus 1. All we need to do is combine like terms and put things in a nice order. So x squared plus x and then minus 6. And that's it. That's as far as we can go. How do we find the domain of this function? Well, this is a parabola, a quadratic function, okay? Quadratic function, parabola, looks like this, remember? So the domain is just all real numbers. Remember, the only time we need to worry about the domain is if we've got a fraction or a radical or an absolute value. Okay? There it is. Okay, next we have f minus g of x. That's the same thing as f of x minus g of x. So we have x minus 5 minus x squared minus 1. This is wrong. We're subtracting all of the x squared minus 1. So we need to put that in parentheses. Then we'll distribute. So we have plus 1 there. See, big difference. And then we can write it. We've got negative x squared plus x minus 4. Again, we have a quadratic. We don't need to mess with anything about the domain. It's just negative infinity to infinity. The next one, we're going to multiply. So f times g of x is the same thing as f of x times g of x. So we take f of x, and we have to put it in parentheses here, and we're going to multiply it by g of x, which again we have to put in parentheses because we're multiplying all of these things. So we have to full. X times x squared is x cubed. X times negative 1 is negative x. Negative 5 times x squared is negative 5x squared. And negative 5 times negative 1 is positive 5. There's nothing that can be combined there. But we can rewrite it so that our exponents are in order. But that is our answer. What's the domain? Well, this is a cubic. We don't have a square root. We don't have a fraction. Nothing like that. Ends up looking like this. But, so the domain is just negative infinity to infinity again. All real numbers. And last, dividing. So this f divided by g of x is the same thing as f of x divided by g of x. So f of x is x minus 5. G of x is x squared minus 1. Now, we would simplify this if we could. Don't write this down. X squared minus 1 factors to be x plus 1 times x minus 1. If we could cancel something out, then we would. But we can't, so we just leave it like this. What's the domain, though? Now we've got our fraction. So this one is iffy. We need to realize that the bottom cannot be equal to 0. So set your bottom equal to 0 and see what cannot go on the bottom. So add 1 to both sides. Take the square root of 1. Positive or negative 1 cannot work on the bottom because then we would get a 0. So our domain in interval notation is negative infinity. And then we'll stop at negative 1, but we can't include it. So we use a parenthesis. Unioned with. Starting back at negative 1, but parenthesis again because it's not included, to 1. But again, not included, so parenthesis. Unioned with, parenthesis 1, to infinity. And that's it for this section.